Welcome to the Renaissance Spirit.
I know, dear viewer, that when you first hear my name, Tacitus, you're likely thinking one of two things. Who is this guy? Or, oh, that dusty old historian whose books I've pretended to read. Let's be honest, I don't blame you. Who wants to hear from some long-dead Roman who spent his life chronicling the worst moments of an empire while sitting in a toga that probably smelled like stale olives? But bear with me, my story, though ancient, has surprising relevance to your world today. And if nothing else, at least I can promise some scandal, drama, and a fair share of biting commentary about the human condition, which, trust me, hasn't changed in 2,000 years. I wasn't always the world-weary critic of emperors and sycophants you may know me to be. I began life, as we all do, with a spark of ambition, and if I may be honest with myself, a bit too much faith in human decency. Born sometime in 56 AD, under the reign of Nero, yes, the madman who fiddled while Rome burned, I was a child of the provinces, not the glittering capital. My birthplace, somewhere in the regions of northern Italy or Gaul, was far removed from the political cesspool of Rome, though my family was well enough connected to send me off to the city's elite schools. My family. Let's just say we had a complicated relationship, like most Roman families. I wasn't born into poverty, but we weren't exactly rolling in riches either. My father was likely a Roman equestrian respectable, but not part of the senator class we all secretly envied. Still, he valued education and ensured I studied under the best rhetoricians of the day. Be eloquent, Tacitus, they said. Speak with wisdom, and your future will be secure. Ha! What fools we were. I soon learned that wisdom and eloquence are dangerous commodities in a world ruled by paranoid emperors who saw every clever phrase as a potential dagger aimed at their backs. My education, however, did arm me with a sharp tongue, and for that, I'm grateful. I sharpened that blade over the years, first as an advocate, then as a senator, and finally as a historian. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you through the stages of my life, one at a time, as we dissect the corpse of Roman society together. In the end, you'll see why I wrote what I did, why my works are still read, or pretended to be read today, and why I had more than a few things to say about power, tyranny, religion, and all the nonsense that comes with it. You'll also learn why I, Tacitus, am still honored your best guides to the maddening circus of current affairs and politics, ancient or modern. Now that you know a bit about my origins, modest, provincial, yet properly schooled in the fine art of surviving Rome's political carnivores, let's talk about my real contributions to posterity. My works. You know, those ancient, yellowed texts you might have skimmed in a college class if you were feeling particularly studious, or heard about in passing during a lecture on Roman history. Let me set the record straight. My writings aren't just historical chronicles, they're desperate attempts to preserve the truth in a world drowning in lies, sycophancy, and corruption. That's why they still matter. First, let's talk about my most significant contributions, the Annals and the Histories. The titles may sound dry, but behind these clinical names lies the real dirt of imperial Rome. The Annals detail the years from Tiberius to Nero, those lovely little tyrants who perfected the art of imperial cruelty. If you want to see the gradual corrosion of Rome's soul, watch how these men used treachery, fear, and paranoia to tighten their grip on power. They have their own stories to tell in our channel's other videos. I witnessed firsthand how even the finest citizens were reduced to groveling flatterers or traitorous assassins. The Senate, a shadow of its former self, a room full of old men too afraid to sneeze without asking the emperor's permission. Then there's the histories. If you thought the annals were bleak, the histories take you to the edge of chaos. I focused on the year of the four emperors, 69 AD, a year so filled with backstabbing and betrayal that it makes your modern political scandals look like children's games. My reflections of the year of the four emperors will be a topic for an upcoming video. Imagine four men, each claiming the title of emperor, while Rome itself is left to burn. Each would-be Caesar seemed more incompetent or brutal than the last, and the empire hung by a thread. And for what? The endless hunger for power. Spoiler alert, Vespasian finally triumphed, but Rome never really recovered. So why should you care? Because my works don't just describe events. They expose the eternal weaknesses of power, the moral decay that sets in when a single person controls too much. The strongman leader who can save the day? A myth. More often than not, these men are the ones who drag a nation down into the muck. Look around you, dear viewer. Do you see any parallels? But it wasn't all doom and gloom. I had a few moments of dry wit, particularly in Agricola, a biography of my father-in-law. There's something a little amusing about writing a flattering account of a family member while knowing that no one would dare criticize it. After all, who's going to argue with the son-in-law? It was also my way of saying, look, Rome wasn't always a pit of despair. Once, we had noble men like Agricola who actually cared about governing well. And of course, there's Germania, a fascinating work, if I may say so myself. Here, I get to play anthropologist, describing the barbarian tribes beyond Rome's borders. It's ironic, really. These so-called savages often displayed more honor and freedom than the so-called civilized Romans who ruled the world. Ah, the bitter twist. The barbarians' rudimentary tribal system might seem crude, but at least they hadn't yet learned to sell their souls for the hollow glitter of empire. My works weren't just histories, they were moral lessons, cautionary tales, and perhaps a bit of therapy for a man who saw too much and trusted too little. If you think I wrote just to catalogue events, you're missing the point. I was documenting the decline of Rome's spirit, hoping that someday, maybe even today, someone might read my words and learn from our mistakes. I have hope in you. But alas, human nature is what it is. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that history, no matter how tragic, tends to repeat itself. Keep that in mind as we move forward. The story of tyranny is just getting started. Tyranny. If there's one topic that keeps me awake in the grave, it's this. In fact, I could fill volumes on the subject, and I did if you've been paying attention. You see, it wasn't enough for me to simply record the events of Rome's slow descent into chaos. No, I had to understand why it happened. What was it about the Roman Empire that allowed the most vicious, paranoid, and incompetent individuals to climb to the highest seats of power? What made us tolerate these monsters? Better yet, why do we still tolerate them today? Let's get one thing straight. Tyranny isn't just a bad emperor in a purple robe. It's a disease that spreads from the top down, infecting every part of society. But in a larger sense, it's from the bottom up. When people give up on their rights, abandon reason, compassion, and virtue, when they have neither the time or inclination to care about the state, inevitably a wolf in sheep's clothing takes advantage of the situation. I saw it in Rome, and I'm willing to bet you see it in your own world too. When men like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero sat on the throne, it wasn't just their perverse whims that defined their reigns. It was the way their absolute power corrupted the very fabric of Roman life. Under their rule, the Senate, the proud ancient institution that once guided Rome through its golden days, became a pathetic assembly of cowards, too afraid to stand up to the emperor's abuses. Let me give you an example. When Tiberius retreated to his pleasure palace on Capri, indulging in every imaginable vice, the Senate willingly debased itself to win his favor. Senators, who should have been the guardians of the Republic's values, groveled, offering empty praises and passing decrees that honored the very man who was strangling their freedoms. Why? Because once a tyrant takes power, fear becomes the primary currency. Speak against the emperor, and you'd find yourself accused of treason, hauled off to a sham trial, and executed before you could blink. Better to flatter, bow, and scrape than risk losing your head. But here's the cruel irony. Even those who served the tyrant were never safe. I lost track of how many ambitious men I saw rise through the ranks of the imperial court, only to be destroyed by the very system they supported. The closer you were to the emperor, the more likely you were to be seen as a threat, a rival. That's the nature of tyranny. It devours its own. Now, some of you may be wondering, but Tacitus, surely Rome needed a strong ruler to keep order. Aren't tyrants just a necessary evil? That's the seductive lie of autocracy, isn't it? The idea that a strong man will come along and magically fix everything with a firm hand. I saw this firsthand with Domitian, one of the last emperors I served under. He fancied himself a divine ruler, styling himself after Jupiter. He tightened his grip on the empire, crushing any hint of dissent. And sure, the empire might have been orderly on the surface, but underneath, the soul of Rome was dying, strangled by the very man who claimed to be its protector. Tyranny doesn't fix anything. It might impose order for a time, but it does so by robbing a society of its moral backbone. A people who live in constant fear of their rulers can't thrive. They can't innovate. They can't speak the truth. Instead, they become shadows of themselves, reduced to playing roles in a twisted performance where the emperor is always right, and anyone who says otherwise is silenced. What frustrated me the most was how predictable it all was. Every emperor who came to power with the promise of restoring Rome ended up repeating the same bloody cycle: consolidation of power, elimination of rivals, suppression of free speech, and the inevitable descent into paranoia. It was maddening to watch, knowing full well that this was all avoidable if only we had remembered our Republican values. But of course, by the time men like me were in a position to do anything, it was already too late. The Republic had been dead for decades, and the empire, though it wore the mask of strength, was rotting from the inside out. That's what tyranny does, my friends. It kills not just the body, but the soul of a nation. And the worst part? People let it happen, because for some reason, they believe that one man with absolute power is the solution to their problems. If only they knew. If only they had listened to those of us who could see the truth. But no, tyranny is always easier than freedom. It's a dark temptation, and one that too many succumb to, even today. Now, I wonder, does this sound familiar to you? I'll let you be the judge. Religion. Now, there's a subject that never fails to stir up trouble. For as long as humans have been around, we've had an overwhelming urge to worship something, whether it's a god, a golden calf, or in some cases, a lunatic emperor with a god complex. Rome was no stranger to this. In fact, our empire thrived on a pantheon of gods, each one responsible for a different aspect of life. War, love, agriculture, wine, a particularly important one. We Romans were practical about religion. It wasn't just about piety. It was about keeping the gods on our side, ensuring the stability of the state. But even in my day, I could see that the line between religion and politics was getting uncomfortably blurred. Emperors like Augustus were smart enough to use religion as a tool, elevating themselves to near-divine status to legitimize their rule. Augustus may have claimed to restore the Republic, but let's be real. He made sure the cult of the emperor was alive and well, intertwining his rule with the favor of the gods. What's better than power? Power backed by divine authority. And so began the slippery slope toward theocratic nonsense. Now, let me be clear. I'm not anti-religion. Gods, spirits, omens, these things have their place. But when a state starts to force religion onto the masses, when it intertwines faith with governance to the point where questioning the ruler becomes a sin as much as a crime, you're on dangerous ground. It's one thing to fear an emperor. It's another thing entirely to fear him, because he's supposedly been chosen by the gods, or God. Rome never quite fell into full-blown theocracy, but there were moments when we came dangerously close. Take Domitian, for instance. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Imagine the absurdity. This man, flesh and blood like the rest of us, well, maybe with a bit more paranoia, insisted he was divine, and the people went along with it. Why? Because challenging his divinity meant challenging not just the emperor, but the gods themselves. Under a theocracy, the ruler is untouchable, not just by law, but by belief. And here's where things really go off the rails. When the state forces a singular religion on its people, it inevitably breeds division and resentment. People naturally have different beliefs, and when you try to suppress that diversity in favor of a state-imposed religion, you only create tension. Look at how the Romans treated the early Christians. We persecuted them, burned them, fed them to lions, all because they refused to worship the emperor. Did that suppress Christianity? No. If anything, it made the religion stronger, feeding its sense of martyrdom and righteousness. This brings me to the core of my complaint against theocracy. It destroys freedom of thought. The moment you intertwine religious belief with state power, you silence anyone who dares to think differently. And when people are no longer free to think, society withers. Tyranny can thrive under the cloak of theocracy because it turns dissent into heresy. If you can't question the emperor without questioning the gods, you can't question anything. I saw it in Rome, and I see it in your world today. Those who would force a singular religious doctrine onto the state aren't interested in morality or salvation. No, they're interested in control. Religion, when used as a tool of power, becomes a chain to bind the minds of the masses, a way to justify injustice and oppression under the guise of divine will. So, what do I think of theocratic states? I think they are the death of democracy. When a ruler or ruling class can claim divine authority, there's no longer any need for debate, discussion, or accountability. What's worse is that it gives those in power the moral high ground, making it easier for them to commit atrocities in the name of a higher purpose. Humanity, in its desperation to understand the divine, too often enslaves itself to tyrants who use religion as a weapon. I saw it happen in Rome, and I see it happening in your world. Whether it's an emperor claiming to be a god or a modern politician wrapping themselves in the mantle of religion to justify their policies, the result is the same: oppression, division, and the death of liberty. A society must be free to worship or not worship as it chooses. When you take that freedom away, you take away the very essence of what makes a person human: the ability to think, to question, to believe as they will. And that, dear viewer, is why theocratic states are bad for humanity, and yes, bad for democracy. So, we've reached the end of my little self-defense, dear viewer. If you've stayed with me this long, you've probably caught on to a recurring theme: the dangers of unchecked power, whether in the hands of a tyrant, an emperor, or, brace yourselves, a movement that cloaks itself in religion to justify its dominance. Now, I'll admit, my vision of the future didn't extend to your time, and certainly not to your distant lands I could only dream of. But having surveyed the situation from my timeless vantage point, I feel qualified to offer a few opinions on what you call the far right and Islamic republics like Iran, or Christian nationalism in countries like America today, or for that matter, one-man rule in former communist countries like North Korea, Russia, and China, who are forced to defer and bow to their leaders, much like Domitian and his so-called divine will. But for the purposes of this video, let's stick with Christian nationalism for a moment, partly because people in countries like North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China are probably not able to watch this video. You're lucky that you still can. Let's start with the obvious. If there's one thing I've made painfully clear in my observations of Rome, it's that any time politics is entwined with divine authority, bad things tend to follow. Whether it's the emperors who claimed to rule by divine right, or the modern politicians who suggest they're enacting God's will, the result is the same: less freedom, more control. And I must say, I'm seeing some disturbing parallels between my time and yours. The rise of Christian nationalism. The idea that a nation is or should be a Christian nation is deeply troubling, not because Christianity itself is inherently dangerous, but because, as I've already mentioned, theocratic impulses lead to authoritarianism. Once you declare that your God endorses your political platform, you've effectively silenced all opposition. After all, who wants to argue with the Almighty? You see, it's not the religion that's the problem. It's the marriage of religion and state. Look at what happens when political movements like the far right wrap themselves in the cloak of a nation's flag and the Bible of Christianity. They not only claim moral superiority, but actively demonize anyone who dares to challenge them. Critics aren't just wrong, they're godless, or worse, actively evil. It's an old trick one I saw in Rome when emperors declared themselves divine. Once you've convinced the people that your rule is divinely ordained, well, you can justify just about anything. Wars? Sure, it's God's will. Crushing dissent? Of course, heretics must be silenced. And here's where the parallels with my time become eerily familiar. The far right, much of the modern world claims to be defending traditional values, much like the Roman emperors, who insisted they were restoring the old ways while, in reality, consolidating power for themselves. Christian nationalists may claim they want to preserve a nation's moral foundation, but in practice, they're pushing toward a system where only one belief system is allowed to thrive. History tells us where this road leads. Once you start using religion to justify political power, you end up with less freedom and more tyranny. Modern democracies and republics were created to curtail this through the separation of church and state for good reason. Look at the rhetoric of Christian nationalism. It's not enough for these groups to simply live by their faith. No, they want the state to enforce it. They want laws to reflect their particular interpretation of Christianity, and anyone who disagrees is painted as an enemy of both the state and God. In my day, we had something similar with the imperial cult worship the emperor or face the consequences. Your far right is following the same script, just with a different deity. Let me offer you some advice from the grave. Beware the strong man wrapped in religious garb. They always promise to restore greatness, to defend the faith, to save the nation. But more often than not, they're really defending their own power. They'll tell you they're protecting your values, but in reality, they're undermining the very thing that makes a society thrive. Freedom of thought. I've seen this story play out before. The fusion of religion and state power creates a dangerous cocktail that leaves little room for dissent, creativity, or progress. And while it might provide short-term stability, in the long run, it weakens the state. A nation cannot flourish if it demands ideological purity from its citizens. Rome, for all its flaws, was at its strongest when it allowed for diversity of thought, of belief, of practice. The moment we started demanding conformity under the guise of divine authority, we began to crumble. So, what would I think of the far right and Christian nationalism in the world today? Frankly, I'd see it as a return to the mistakes of the past. Theocratic impulses always lead to division. They breed a mindset that sees the world in black and white. The righteous and the damned, the true believers and the heretics. And when politics becomes a matter of faith, compromise becomes impossible. You're not just negotiating policy, you're defending God's will, and anyone who opposes you becomes an existential threat. I'll leave you with this. The strength of any nation lies not in its ability to impose a singular belief system, but in its ability to allow many. Tyranny, whether secular or religious, thrives on control, on silencing opposition. But a truly great society embraces the messy, chaotic, glorious cacophony of differing opinions, beliefs, and ideas. If the far right succeeds in creating Christian nations, they might just find that the nation they create is smaller, weaker, and more fragile than the one they destroyed. And now, dear traveler, I hope you understand where history and the contemporary intersect. People, you are the same as we were. After all, humanity hasn't really changed much in the past 100,000 years. We come to the end of our discourse, yet this is but the beginning of your journey. As I, Tacitus, have endeavored to impress upon you, the study of history is no idle pastime. It is the very key to unlocking the nature of the human condition. It is through the lens of our past that we can better understand the present, and through that understanding, we can shape the future, not as passive spectators, but as engaged and virtuous actors in the great drama of our age. The Renaissance spirit, to which this channel is dedicated, calls upon each of us to cultivate a world where justice, equity, and humanity thrive, not merely as ideals, but as imperatives. The issues facing humanity today, whether they be political, environmental, or societal, are not problems for others to solve. No, they are the responsibility of each and every one of us. By studying history, understanding the human spirit, and practicing reason, compassion, and empathy, we arm ourselves with the very tools necessary to combat the tyranny and injustice that still threaten us. This channel, like the Renaissance itself, is a call to arms for the true polymaths among us, those who thirst for knowledge in all its forms, whether it be in the realms of history, philosophy, politics, or science. The Roman Empire, my time, serves as a perfect mirror for your world. In its rise and fall, its grandeur, and its decay, you find all the lessons you need. But it is not enough to study these lessons. You must live them. Knowledge is not a thing to be passively consumed, but actively applied in the service of truth, justice, and reason. The Renaissance brought forth an age of humanism, of enlightenment, a time when men and women pursued the highest virtues, seeking not just personal greatness, but the betterment of all mankind. In this spirit, I urge you to carry forward the flame of compassion, of understanding, and above all, of action. Engage with the world, not as a distant observer, but as a participant in the unfolding story of our shared humanity. What will your legacy be? Will the future remember you as the generation that allowed democracy to wither, that turned a blind eye to the suffering of the earth and climate catastrophe? Or will it praise you for your courage, for your willingness to confront the great challenges of our time with wisdom, grace, and tenacity? Our posterity awaits the verdict, and it is we who must deliver it. The Renaissance spirit is not merely a philosophy, but a way of life, an invitation to learn, to grow, to think deeply, and to act decisively. Join us in this quest as we follow in the footsteps of those who came before us, seeking to forge a better world for those who come after. Subscribe, engage, and be part of this great dialogue with both the past and the future. Live the Renaissance spirit. Or, as we might say in my native tongue, Vive Renaissance Spiritus. For history is not dead, my friends, merely awaiting your understanding. Historia non est mortua, sed intellectus noster. The future is yours to shape. Make it one of reason, virtue, and compassion. As for me, I'll be watching. History, after all, is a cruel tutor, and I have a front row seat.